Hello, all you happy people. I wanted to say a few more things about the subject of economic growth, how we graphically show it. And the other thing I'd like to do is comment a little bit on I don't know, the accuracy, I guess, of using economic growth as a measurement of the quality or the standard of living. Okay, and this was kind of like we did in a previous thought about per capita GDP, and we'll go over that just a little bit. But remember last time what we did is we talked about how uh, the aggregate production function and labor placed the long run aggregate supply, which is the limit. It corresponds to the line in the production possibilities curve, or the curve there, as being the most the economy can do. So, what we have here in order here, let's say, first of all, we have the labor market. So, we have, an average wage there, and we have the quantity of labor there. And we have so I can see this, or so you can see this. We have a demand curve for labor, which are the firms hiring labor, and all of the firms hiring labor for the whole economy. And then we have a supply curve for labor. That is the people looking for work. Okay. And we have the quantity of labor that is employed here at the average wage. Okay. And then we can relate this quantity of labor to the production of gross domestic product. And we do that by the aggregate production function here. Okay. Now, in the aggregate production function, we have the GDP, the real GDP, on this axis here. And we have the quantity of labor on the x-axis. So what we have here is the aggregate production function that will look like this, like that. And why does it look like that again? Because of diminishing marginal returns. That if you hire one person, they'll start things off and increase the total substantially, but then as you hire more people, they will contribute less and less to the total, till if you hire too many people, they're stepping on each other's foot and hitting each other with ladders, swinging around like. If you want to see the diseconomies of scale, just excuse me, watch a Three Stooges episode. That's kind of how it works there. And then, of course, from that, from seeing that we have Q1 being the standard or the total amount of employment, so we have Q1 there, and in terms of productivity, go up to that curve there, and they will produce this much of output here. GDP star, say. Okay. So, and this is on the economy hitting all 12 cylinders or whatever. And then we go to the the aggregate supply and demand curves here. And we have the average price level here, which is the implicit price deflator, and we have real GDP over here. And so at Q1 here, wherever that corresponds, that represents the limits, the capacity of the economy. So, since it does represent the capacity, long-term capacity of the economy there, we have the long-run aggregate supply curve that is not influenced by price levels necessarily because of the fact that it has long enough time to fully adjust to everything. Okay? And that corresponds to a point on the production possibilities curve that we talked about a little earlier. And so, now what happens in a case where that results in the long run aggregate supply curve being moved? Okay, let's say there is a case where there's some intense training of workers. And so there's a workforce that is more qualified. Okay? Well, first of all, in that case, at every quantity level of labor, they will produce more GDP. They're more productive. And so the GDP, or the production function, the aggregate production function here, will actually shift upward, still in the same shape, but it will shift up. Okay? Now, with that with that increased productivity, the demand for workers is going to increase. So that means that at every wage, firms will hire more workers. And so the demand curve for labor will shift out like that. Okay? So, where the supply equates with the demand, Q2, let's say, that might correspond to this point here. Okay, that's Q2. So a higher quantity of labor produces more. Okay? So this will produce a higher level of GDP, which will, if that's GDP 1, it'll produce a higher level of GDP, which is GDP 2, say. And so what that will do is move the long run aggregate supply curve out that way. Okay? And that's an example of economic growth, the potential. And this is akin to the production possibilities curve where we had, say, consumer goods and capital goods here, where it was like that. Well, the new productivity of the labor force moves this curve out like that. So that kind of connects on to the movement of the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Now there's a case here though where the long run aggregate supply curve moves anyway without a corresponding shift in the aggregate production function. Let's just talk about that real quick here. And again, if you don't quite get this, I'll be here. I'll be at the library hopefully tomorrow afternoon maybe, and at least Wednesday and Thursday. So, okay. So, we have a case here, say. We have the supply and demand curve of labor at the old productivity. Okay. And that equilibrium is right here at the average wage. And we have our aggregate production function here. Still the same shape, reflecting diminishing marginal returns. And the quantity here, Q1, is right there, Q1 of labor. And that labor can produce this much, okay? Now, let's say that the labor force increases, say, through immigration or people becoming work age, say. Okay. And so what that'll mean, let's see here, the long run aggregate supply curve is not shifted yet in this example. And how are we doing on time? 11 minutes. Yeah, we'll finish this up here. So what happens then, with a greater supply of labor, the supply curve moves out like that. Okay. And what we have here in this case is a Q2, Q1, okay? And this will correspond to Q1, Q2 here, say. And Q2 will produce more of the productive capacity will move out a little bit. And so, again, that will make long run aggregate supply move out from Q1 to Q2 there. Okay? So everything's connected, interconnected. How is the productivity? And productivity is mentioned by having GDP, real GDP, over the population of an economy. Well, higher productivity tends to go with a better standard of living. There's things that will cause higher productivity. One thing is skills of the labor force. Another thing will be technology, to where the person operating the technology can produce more with it because of the technology. Other things that will help productivity is general regulation by the government not being too restrictive. Okay. But again, as we said before, the productivity, the per capita GDP for the average person doesn't mean that his or her standard of living is increasing. There's a positive association with it, but there are distributional things. What if the workers are underpaid and a landed elite in an economy grabs the profits? That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a complete, accurate portrayal of the standard of living. But anyway, there's a number of things that cause economic growth, and government tax policies among those. And we'll go from there. Thanks a lot for your attention, and the next one will be the review for the midterm.